Dart and Tribeca section of Manhattan, thank you. When you learned that a Sunday late in the day soap opera in Russia was interrupted with a bulletin about John Kennedy, when you learned that it was the lead story in just about every civilized nation with electronic media to have a newscast in the evening or afternoon, you know what makes up the elements of a global news story these days, where the lack of an FDR and a Churchill and a war going on means that the real and true celebrities of a society become its great and big figures that get so much coverage and make it a global event. This one is no different. Keith Miller is on post for us in London tonight, our time, morning their time, where the early Bulldog editions of the major papers are out to show people in the United States just how big a story this is over there.
It's been extraordinary. I have to show you the Sunday Times. Look at this. John Kennedy Jr. feared dead in a plane crash. It has dominated the television, radio, and newspapers throughout Europe. Programming, as you mentioned, was interrupted in Russia. It was also interrupted in Italy, France, and Germany. And here in Britain, it has dominated the television news reports, with people going back, showing biographies. It's quite incredible, really, how John Jr. has affected these people. Maybe it goes back to this. The Daily Mail here on their Sunday edition says, Kennedy's son feared dead in air crash. This goes back, of course, to President Kennedy, a very well-loved president over here. Also, the Kennedys' Irish roots gave them a European connection. But as you said, the celebrity traveled far, and John Jr. was certainly one of those. And I must say also there was some connection, at least in terms of the British public, saying that they felt very close to him, as they did to Diana. One of those people that somehow you could connect with, perhaps because his public life was broadcast around the world, even in good times, his marriage, for instance. And of course, many people over here also knew that he was the publisher of a very successful magazine.
And Keith, the unifier is the reaction here in the States this morning was no different than the reaction of the average Londoner there your time this afternoon. It was within a few words of, how could this happen to this family?
Well, what you get, Brian, is what we had, of course, with Diana, a tragedy, a person so young who seemed to be so successful, a happy marriage, at least certainly for the Kennedy, and also you had somebody who was in the public eye and seemed comfortable with it. And we knew about his successes, and then to have a tragedy strike somebody who was so young, who we think we know in some ways. It's interesting how our media has actually put us in touch with these people like never before. And so when something like this happens, I think everybody, including those of us in Europe and further abroad, feel the grief as well.
And Keith, you just landed on it. That's the unifier. Thank you, Keith Miller in London for us tonight, morning their time. We have on the telephone with us from suburban Virginia a man active in the Democratic Party of late, a longtime advisor to President Clinton, a colleague of ours at NBC these days, Paul Begala. Paul, I understand you spoke with John Kennedy not too long ago, and what can you tell us about that conversation? And I guess it's impossible not to talk politics with a Democrat named Kennedy.
Sure, exactly. In fact, he called me from jury duty. He got called in Manhattan into jury duty, and we sort of laughed at the notion of that because he's a former DA. He said it was fun to see his fellow folks from the DA's office there. And then, of course, we did. He called back that night. He had to go back into the jury room and get bounced out because he's a former prosecutor. But then they called back that night, and, you know, I'm also contributing editor to his magazine, and I helped him launch it back when the George magazine began. And I asked him, you know, look, is the magazine going okay? How's everything going there? And he assured me that things were going quite well there. And we both swapped stories about Hillary, of course. He's a New Yorker. I don't really know that state. I'm from Texas. So I asked his thoughts about New York press. He was kind of asking me what the latest from Washington was. But definitely a guy, you know, he's on top of his game. I think he's committed to making a go of the magazine. He had been approached, I don't know if you know this, years ago when Bill Bradley retired to run in New Jersey. And there was a lot of talk he might run in New York, but he very much wants to make a go of this magazine and put everything else aside. And, you know, I think that's something I think that he very much sees as fulfilling some of his father's as well as his mother's legacy and bringing together the celebrity that he brings to any enterprise and to try to use that to bring a new generation of people into public service with the same sort of enthusiasm that his father did in a more traditional route.
Paul, a friend of mine told me today that his big frustration these days that really dominated the last couple of weeks was this foot injury. He injured it in a sporting activity, and it was his love of all other sporting activities. He was angry at himself. Ligaments were involved. That meant long-term. He hated the length of the recovery. He hated the cast. He finally was on a cane for this trip this weekend, and the light was at the end of the tunnel.
Right. I mean, he's about the same age, 38, and he's in a lot better shape than I am. But just sort of get to hit that age in your late 30s when things start going pop that you don't want to, and that's something that he's always going to be seen as someone very fit and active, and I think it was a source of enormous frustration. And it's a wonderful thing that just that was the sort of the hardest thing going on in his life. He was bedeviled by the paparazzi, but he had never publicly ever complained about that.
Paul, is there a way to preserve a confidence with a friend and indicate to us his opinion of the upcoming Senate race in New York?
It was more, actually, even there, more as an editor and a journalist. He's obviously from a Democratic family, but he was kind of asking me, pumping me for information. He said, look, have you talked to Hillary? Is she really going to go? Well, what do you think is happening? And, of course, I would turn it the other way and say, look, you know New York. I don't. Tell me what they're likely to do to her. But he never really said what his partisan affiliation would be in that sort of race. I know because he's close to the President and First Lady, and they've had Carolyn over and he many times. And his mother was, of course, very close to Mrs. Clinton and a great source of inspiration to Hillary, particularly in the early days of the Clinton administration when I think John's mother was very supportive of Hillary and really tried to help her figure out how to adjust to the fishbowl that she was entering into.
One last thing. He was his own man. After his mother died, he made sure to say she died on her own terms. And that's the way he kind of carved out his life the past couple of years. He had a crossroads, could have lived any number of places, done any number of things.
Very much so. In fact, the most sort of headstrong guy that way that you can imagine. Nobody could blame John if he decided just to live his life off his father's name. And he never wants to do that. He wants to make sure that he's making his own way, and it's got to be a non-traditional way with him. It would have been very easy to slide into, a political career of a traditional sort, and instead he decided to do something very risky. He put his name on the line for a magazine that nobody thought could succeed, and now 3-4 years into the enterprise, I think is doing just fine. But very much wanted to make sure he didn't become a prisoner, I think, of that Kennedy myth. It really honors the name, loves his family, and is totally devoted to them, but at the same time, in a very headstrong way, wants to make his own way.
Hey, Paul, horrible reason to talk. Thank you, though, for calling in tonight.
Brian, take care.
We also can point out the Kennedys and Clintons have spent a measurable, significant amount of time together over the years, and President Clinton has enjoyed it so. With Jack Kennedy gone, that was his idol. He still has a connection to the remainder of the Kennedy family. Now another one has apparently gone tonight, and we say apparently. There's still a rescue effort underway. That should be underlined. NBC's veteran White House correspondent John Palmer has a look at how this president at Camp David today reacted to this, along with the rest of Washington.
The president, who has appeared with John F. Kennedy Jr. on several occasions in recent years to promote a variety of social issues and causes, today directed the federal government to lend all possible assistance in the search effort for his missing plane. Aides say Mr. Clinton first called Housing Secretary Andrew Cuomo, who is married to Kerry Kennedy, daughter of the late Senator Robert Kennedy, to express his concern. Later calls were placed by the president to Senator Ted Kennedy and to John F. Kennedy Jr.'s sister, Caroline Schlossberg. Many of the tourists who gathered outside the gates of the White House today expressed shock at news that the plane was missing.
It's a kind of Greek tragedy with the family. You've seen so many of them die. We've all experienced that. And here's another one, so incredibly young.
He had his own niche. He established the magazine to become his own man, and that was pretty commendable because he wasn't trying to live off of his family fortune. It is a shame what happened.
I think people have a lot of empathy for a family that seems to be so blessed and yet so cursed by fame and fortune and celebrity.
At Arlington National Cemetery, a bouquet of flowers with the words "Praying for John Jr." was left today at President Kennedy's gravesite near the Eternal Flame. Here, too, people expressed concern and disbelief.
It's very upsetting. Yeah. I can still remember where I was when John Kennedy was killed, and it just doesn't seem fair.
All across the nation and throughout much of the world, people followed the search efforts any way they could. Near the Kennedy compound on Cape Cod, an expression of hope, a yellow ribbon placed around a telephone pole.